I guess so. All right, cool. Well, welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be here at GTM Forward. I think I was at the I was a speaker at the very first GA4 Forward or GA Forward. So it's fun to be part of the GTM Forward event too. And I love what Phil and Will are doing at MeasureMind. So it's awesome to be here. All right, so what we're going to talk about today, you may have heard me speak about some of these things, but there's some new stuff too. So I want to be talking about GTM best practices. Oh, wait. No, I don't want to talk about that. I actually want the slide to advance. There we go. I don't want to talk about GTM best practices because I don't really know what those are. You know, who says they're best practices? There isn't a committee out there, or maybe it's Phil's tool that will tell you whether it's best practices or not. But I don't like to think of them as best practices. Let me move this up. I like to think of them as Fred's practices. And what do I mean by that? It's not that I'm so self-centered that everything I do is great. I don't think that's true at all. But I do spend a lot of time in GTM. And I've learned a lot over the years, and you know, the speaker we had earlier today was Julian Jueneman, and that's whom I learned GTM from originally. I love Julian, and I still feel like I have a bit of his DNA in my approach to GTM since I was a student of his in an early class. All right, so what we're going to talk about is Fred's practices. Some of the stuff, as I said, you may have seen, some you haven't. Again, I'm Fred Pike, Managing Director at Northwoods in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the GTM Practice Lead. So I've had a couple of interesting experiences recently. As an agency, we often take over GTM containers from other companies. And my friend Dana DiTomaso, who is a great GTM practitioner and has a couple of great courses as well, she was too busy to do some work for a client. So she asked me to take it over, to step in and do some work for that client. And I said, of course, Dana, I'd be happy to. And so when I opened up that GTM container, it's like, oh, look at this. This fits like a silk glove. It's so comfortable. It makes so much sense. It's so well laid out. I understand exactly what's going on here. Oh, right into that glove. Beautiful. I had another client recently who was working with an agency out of the UK, and I'm not going to mention them, and it's not Phil's group, but a very reputable agency. They're a GA360 vendor and everything. So, I mean, they're way up there in their certifications and stuff. And that GTM container was like, oh my God, this is the most uncomfortable, ugly, poorly thought out glove I have ever seen. I can kind of fit my hand in there, but man, it hurts. And you know, that got me thinking, what is it that gives you that silk glove experience? And I think it's a couple of things. One is we live in a time of SOPs, standard operating procedures, which are great because you can do things the same. But I think what's often missing is a level of understanding of why was this SOP set up this way? What can you do? And it's possible to follow an SOP and just do a really crappy job. So what I want to do here is just talk about some of the things that I think are important that will help you turn this really ugly glove into that silk glove. And pretty much everything I do around GTM focuses on three things. I call them the 3Ds. So first is debugging. What am I going to add to the GTM container that is going to help me debug when things go wrong? And oh my God, do things go wrong? You know, things don't always work right from the beginning, or at least not for me. Maybe for other people, but for me, that's not true. The second thing is documenting. I am such a strong believer in documentation. I think that's the hidden strength of GTM versus GA4, for example. In GA4, as you know, it's so hard to add notations. It's so hard. It's basically impossible. In GTM, you can add documentation to everything. And that, to me, is just so beautiful. So we're going to talk about that. And then the whole purpose of how you approach the GTM container, the work you do, is really to help you discern or understand what's going on in that container. So that's my thinking. So the first thing, the very first Fred's practice that I think is really important, and I've done this for a long time and originally learned a portion of this from Simo, Of course, much of what I've learned comes from SEMO, and thank God we have them in this industry. But in the Google tag event settings, that new variable that we have that got introduced 3 months ago or whatever, the first thing I do is add a GTM container and version ID. And let's go live and take a look at what happens with this in some places. Okay. Here we go. All right, so let's go to GoPro, for example. And GoPro is a site I often pick on because I think they do a nice job of working with their GTM container. I also bought I bought the Hero 11 last summer or whatever, and I was just in the US Virgin Islands filming turtles and manta rays in the water. It's just a phenomenal camera. So a really nice website, really great equipment. So I'm on this page here, and if I press F12 to look at obviously the developer console, let's see if we can look at any of these tools, any of these GA4 events. And you've probably seen this, of course. These things down here are coming from this Data Layer Inspector Plus Chrome extension. So in the GA4 event, there is, if I can find it quickly, there it is. There's a event parameter container ID of GTM WLS6. Okay, that's kind of nice. Let me get back to, there we go. That's kind of nice, but it doesn't include the version ID. So this is still an example of that glove not fitting well. And why is that? It's because the container ID is useful, as shown here. And where it's useful is if you're an agency and you have a whole bunch of GTM containers that you're working with. And I always like to grab that GTM container and search for that one so I know I'm going into the right GTM container. But that's only part of the issue. The really important thing is not the container, but which version. And the reason that's important is because clients will come to me and say, hey, last July, something changed. We used to be able to track something, and now that tracking is broken. And the very first thing I do, if they have GTM on their site, which they almost always do, the very first thing I do is go into the versions and see, okay, did a new version get published on July 15th or whatever date that was? And if so, I want to take a look at that version and see what changed there, what changes were made in the GTM container, and that often points me to where things got broken. So having the version ID, I think, is just super important. And let's take a look at an example of the site that does have that, USPS. If we look at, I think, anything, stamps and supplies, let's look at I hope it'll show up here. So we still have GA stuff here. If we look at the GA4 page view, yeah, there it is. Here's our GTM settings. So we have the GTM container ID, which is important because I can find it. And now we can see that this is version 664. So if I'm trying to see if something got broken, I can go in and look at version 663 and figure out what the change was and if something broke there. So I really like having that. I'm not a huge fan of that OR sign that we've got there, the regex OR, but that's okay. At least we've got all the information in there. So let's go back to our slide deck here. We continue to have our GTM containers. All right, so here's an example of USPS. And when you set this up in your own GTM container, here's the stuff you want to do. You do want to include the version ID. You don't want to break it up into two parameters. And this is the only time that I'm aware of in my approach to GA4 tracking, at any rate, where I don't break things up into multiple parameters. One of the beauties of GA4, of course, is the 25 parameters I can describe an event. So I typically have just one field of information in each parameter. But the GTM info is really, even though it's 2 bits of information, the container ID and the version ID, it's essentially 1 bit of information. You're not going to use one without the other. So don't break it into the 2, can just do it as 1. And this is my preferred way of doing it. Again, Fred's practices. It's not to say that USPS did it wrong or anything, but actually specify what the heck that second thing is, version ID. If we look at USPS, unless you know GTM, unless you're aware of what they're doing, you don't know what that 664 is. But the way it's spelled out here with the version ID, you would know what it is. Do change the name. And what do I mean by that? When I first started doing this years ago, I did call it, as we see here, GTM container and version ID. Okay, that's descriptive. It's pretty long. And these days, if I'm doing something from scratch, and if you're going to start doing this from scratch, just call it GTM info or GTM settings like USPS did. This is a nuance, but you don't really need the GTM container and version ID. It's going to be pretty clear enough from how it gets set up over here. So if you're starting from scratch, do change it to GTM info. At Northwoods, where we have technical debt with this, where we have GTM container and version ID going back years, we can't do it as much. All right. And they use GTM settings. Great. So I'm fine with GTM info, GTM settings, any of those. Now I keep talking about, I'm going to go back to version 663 and see what happened. So one of the things that is going to help you, that this GTM version ID is going to help you, is if you have good documentation. I've already begun to talk about documentation. What you want when you publish is a description of what you just published. And there's two places you put this. One is in the name of it, so main nav, and then in the description. And I can't tell you how many GTM containers I see where there is nothing in the description. You're not helping by not spending a minute or two to describe what was in there. Even though I can go in and I can figure it out, okay, these are the tags that changed, these are the tags that got added, this is a trigger that got added or whatever. I can figure it out, but that's a cognitive load on some poor sucker in the future who's going to be in your GTM container and trying to figure it out. So do them a favor. Even more importantly, do yourself a favor, because you're probably the one who's going to be in here 6 months from now trying to figure out, what did I do here? Why did I do this? Be descriptive. Use the frickin' description field and fill it out. And when I go into a GTM container that I'm taking over and there's no names, there's no descriptions, it's like, oh God, I know I'm going to be in for some heartache. So just do yourself a favor. You'll see a theme on documentation throughout this. I love documentation, and I don't think you can have too much of it. All right, second one, the hit timestamp. So this is, again, borrowed from Simo, one of his 13 custom dimensions that you should use, and that's probably an 8-year-old blog post, which I'll have a reference to in a little bit. So the hit timestamp gets applied to each event as it gets sent to GA4. And you may say, well, I have GA4 connected to BigQuery. Why do I need that? In BigQuery, if we look at the analytics table, we've got an event timestamp. Look at that. By default, an event timestamp gets added to every event. Why do I need hit timestamp? Well, partly it's because the way that event timestamp shows up is not in a human readable format. Sure, you can decode that and figure out that that's May 12th or November 30th or whatever. But you can't look at that and figure out, oh, I know what date that is. It's not, it's in UTC. Oh, this didn't read too well. It says UTC, it's not human readable. And it shows up when the hit is processed. This is one of those privacy slides. Evidently, I can't share it. I can just talk about it. That should be white text. But anyway, there is a really interesting post from Alex Ignatenko, and I apologize if I killed his name, recently in LinkedIn, and he long post on this exact thing. And basically, hits from GA4 are sent not one by one, but in so-called batches, and the event timestamp records the batch sending time, not the event time. Usually that's going to be pretty close, but there's no guarantee it's close, and it's not human readable. So put in the hit timestamp. Do include it in the GA event setting, not in Google tag, just put it in the event setting variable. Do use it, even though there is the event timestamp. We talked about that. And don't make it a custom dimension. That second GTM container I mentioned that I just took over, they did the hit timestamp, but they made it a custom dimension in GA4. Now, what does that do? If you have more, what that does, of course, is introduce cardinality. if you have more than 500 values for one parameter in a day, you're going to potentially start hitting cardinality issues, which means you're going to get more other rows. So use it, use it, expect to see it in BigQuery, and there it's going to be readable. Don't make it a custom dimension in GA4. And the source for this, as I mentioned, is CMO Hava, of course. So let's take a look at those two in this wonderful example website I have for my favorite puppy, Shusha. And if you've ever seen me speak before, you know I always speak about Shusha. So I have a dog store for her where you can actually go and you can go to it, you can buy things, but I'm not going to ship you anything. It's not real. So what I have here, here's the example of what actually shows up. We have the GTM container and version ID, perfect. And here's that human readable hit timestamp. And this is modified a tiny bit from how Simo had it. He just had a T and I spelled it out to time. I added the spacing. And the reason I'm doing that is because it's really designed for somebody reading it. And yes, you could process it, you could break it apart in code later and change the T to time or whatever, but I just changed it to be more human readable here. So that's how I approach the hit timestamp. And there it is again, so you can see it a little bit bigger. The other thing, again, documentation. Where did this come from? This came from, here I've got my notes on it. Here's the original JavaScript from Simo, and it's still available on his website. Anytime I'm grabbing something from a blog post, whether it's Simo or Analytics Mania or Measure School or whoever, I always like to include the URL on it. So I know where I got it from and why I'm using it. And I discovered this when I took over a GTM container for a client, and there was one variable that I couldn't quite understand. And it did have a note. It's like, awesome. And said, Larry read about this in a blog. Larry read about this in a blog. Perfect. I don't know who Larry is. I don't know what the blog was. I still don't know why that variable was added. So ever since then, that was like a switch that turned over in my brain. Ever since then, I've tried to include really good documentation when there's anything that's kind of strange. And even at times, okay, so here's the same one again. Here's the blog post and then the revised one. And even at times, I said at the beginning that I use this stuff to debug. I'm not perfect. And sometimes I'm doing things that I don't actually know if this is 100% going to work. It looks like it's going to work, but it may need to be revised. And this is an example where I'm just telling myself, yeah, this is ugly, Fred. And I'm speaking to myself 6 months from now or whatever. This is ugly, Fred. I know this may not look really clean, but this is why I'm doing it. And here it is. So it's just a note to yourself. Documentation is your friend. All right, number 3. Back in the Google Tag event setting, this is probably my number one. If I could just recommend one Fred's practice, it's this, and that is adding a tag name parameter to your tags in GTM. And what you want to do is, of course, have a custom parameter, tag name, tag underscore name, snake case, of course. And then whatever is up here, Google Tag, whatever you're going to call it up here, copy it down here. And why do you want to do that? Because, and I know we're talking about GTM, but so much of what I do is GTM and GA4. So I think from a GA4 mindset a lot. And the reason is in GA4, there are so many event sources. It could come from, an event could come from GTag, from GTM, from setting up an audience, from modify events and GA4 admin, from the add events in GA4 admin, from measurement protocol. So if you're taking over GA4 account and you're trying to figure out where did this event come from, help yourself out. Add that tag name and it'll make a big difference. And we can see some of these places like GoPro does a really nice job of that. GTM tag name. I just go with tag name, but GTM tag name is actually maybe even a better designator than what I do. So if you're going to do anything, change it to GTM tag name. And what you want to do is add it to all events in GTM, add it as an extra parameter in GA4 admin when you, if God forbid, you actually do the add or modify events. If you're sending measurement protocol stuff over to GA4, add it there. The downfall is that it is manual. You have to remember to do it. You have to add it. You have to copy that tag from the top and put it in the tag name. And don't forget to register. Now, if I do create an event in the GA4 admin, I will add it there too with a tag name of GA4 admin event, just so I know where that event is coming from. It's not actually a tag. This create event thing is not really a tag, but it still serves the same purpose. One thing I think is really important is what you call your tags, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But here's an example where we have a GA4 bottom nav tag. Perfect. We have the tag name down here. That's great. But the name of the tag has absolutely nothing to do with the event. The event name is menu click. The tag name is bottom nav tag. Now, I'll tell you, it takes a lot of mental processing to think, if I'm trying to find out what causes menu click, okay, that was in the bottom. It's in the nav on the bottom there, so it's probably the bottom nav tag. You know what? Do yourself a favor and include a portion of the event name, whatever that GA4 event name is, include it in the tag. That's just going to make life a lot easier for you. Less cognitive load, less work for you in the future. Now, I did say that when you add tag name, you have to do it manually. I did see somebody recently say, oh no, it can now be done automatically. And I was like jumping up for joy, but I don't think that works. At least it hasn't worked for me. So what I saw is that if you go into advanced settings, include the tag name and include like what the parameter name there, it would include this GA4 primary nav clicks. That has not worked for me. And this feature, additional tag metadata, has been around in GTM for years. And I remember like 3 years ago talking with Julian Joenneman about this and trying to figure out if I could actually use this to grab the tag name in UA. It never worked out, and it still doesn't work for me. So if you know how to make this automated, if there is something down here that lets you automatically grab that tag name, please let me know. I would love that, because that is a feature that I would love in GTM. All right. I get so excited about this stuff. Sorry. Let me take a quick drink here. So data viz and GTM tag naming. This is kind of an interesting thing. There are some people that I've learned so much about in data viz and data visualization. People like Tim Wilson, who have a course at CXL on it. People like Leah Pika, who is just phenomenal. She has a new book on it as well. Maybe it's a month old or so. Michelle Kiss, I've learned a lot from too. And they're all talking about data visualization, charts, bar graphs, things like that. I think it's important to think about that in terms of GTM tag naming too. And this is an example of a GTM container I took over where I'm changing the name of the party to protect the innocent or whatever. But they had their company name here. So NWS is Northwoods. That's what we use internally. So every event started off, every tag started off with NWS GA4 event tag name 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you look at this and how much of the information on here is actually information and how much of it is noise. There's a lot of noise here. And that's why I think about it in terms of data viz, in that one of the things that you really want to do in great data visualizations is reduce noise, reduce the cognitive load. So if you have a bar chart, don't have all those lines going across. They don't add anything. In this case, we simplified it to two things. One is we got rid of NWS and we got rid of GA4 event. Now, when was GA event a useful name for a tag in GA4? It was useful back in Universal Analytics because we had many different types of universal analytics types. We had page views, we had transactions, we had e-commerce, we had social. So, and we had events, of course. So in those days, in the UA days, saying GA-event-the name of it, that made total sense. In GA4, everything is an event, right? So why include event in there? Just make it GA4 so that they're all grouped together. You could also have them in a folder if you wanted to. And then the tag name. And that is so much easier to look at than this. If you look at a GTM container with 150 tags and all of them start with the name of the company and then the tag, it's like, give me a frickin' break. That is way too much for my poor brain to wade through. Just give it to me like this. Oh, those are the GA4 tags. Oh, there's the name. I don't need event because everything is an event, with the exception of the Google tag, but go along with me. Everything is an event. All right. Next things I want to talk about that I also include in the, as I said, so much of this is GA4. So I'm just going to say, grab the custom Google Click ID if you're running Google Ads, or the Microsoft Click ID if you're running big ads, and store those, grab them in the Google Tag event settings, just set that up as a query. I've got an example here. And the reason we do that, the reason I always put that in the GTM containers I'm working with, is because it's really useful if you're going to be recording offline conversions, which we really like to do where it's applicable. And to do that, you need the Google Click ID, you need the MS Click ID, the Bing Click ID. So just capture it right away as a query, and then you're good. All right, number 6. Let's see, any questions so far? Okay, I think we're good. Oh, and then the other thing I do is I always like to get the client ID. I think that's so useful. If we look at, again, where this comes from CMO, here's an example of what GoPro is doing, and here's the client ID, the Google client ID coming from the _GA cookie. So you may look at that and say, okay, why do they have the S in front of that? The reason they have that is because the Google client ID is everything after the S. And if you send this over to BigQuery, it's going to be treated as an integer, and you're going to lop off after the first 5 numbers over here. So you need to make it a string. And the way GoPro is doing it is that they're adding an S in front of it. The way CMO recommends in his thing is just add a period at the end of it. You could also have a apostrophe at the beginning of it. You just need to do something to capture that and make that a string, not a numeric variable. And if you set that up properly, then in GA4, you'll get the custom gclid, the MS Click ID, and the custom client ID all showing up as user properties. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is, and you know what? So click text and triggers is a refuge of scoundrels. And I'm seeing this less these days than I used to, but a lot of people would set up a trigger based on a click text. And it's like, no, you don't want to do that. And why don't you want to do that? Let's take a look at an example live. So I have the Shusha dog store, and I've got tracking on my top nav here. And actually, let's go into Google Tag Manager and preview this. We'll call it the Developer Console. So if I click on Shop, for example, you'll see that I have a primary nav click, and I have a primary nav click based on the click text. And that click text, it's really fancy. I'm using regex. Wow, regex ignore case to capture all those clicks. Now, you wouldn't do this, but I'm just doing it to prove a point. So yeah, that works. It will capture that. It'll trigger on those. But what's wrong with the click text? Couple things. One is the click text can change, right? It's super easy to change a click text on a CTA button or something. So that may change. The other thing that can happen, and I see this on websites all the time, even US based, only US based companies, and we see many different languages in the pages, it's because people translate them. So now we no longer have shop, we have comercio, we have carro, we have verificar, mi cuenta, camina Xuxa. We have different things. So now if let's clear this. If I click on the cart, we get the primary nav click. So what's going on here? You already know the answer to this, of course. Let's go into Tag Assistant. So on this link click, the primary nav click worked. The bad example, which is with the regex, didn't work. And the reason, of course, is because this carro, the cart, doesn't match any of the text. So the better way to do that, of course, is to use a CSS selector. And what we're doing here is basically anything on this primary menu container, we're capturing that, so it captures everything in that box. I love CSS selectors. I hate click text. I can think of one time in my career where I had to use click text where I couldn't get around it, and it was so painful to have to set that up. But in general, stay away from click text as a trigger thing. If you don't have any other option, fine. But there's almost always a different option. So click text is, I don't know if it's really the refuge of the scoundrels, but whatever. It's Fred's practices. I can say whatever I want, right? All right, next. Ooh, we're kind of wrapping up here. Phil, do I go till 10:25 or 25 after the hour? Can you give me a?
You got 6 minutes left.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, number 8. And by the way, I love I love and hate ChatGPT. So you may wonder why my numbers 8 and 7 looked a little bit funky. It's because I could not get ChatGPT. I could not get Dolly to give me a cube with a 7 or an 8, no matter how many times I tried. So they're listed together. So I had to cheat like this. Evidently, I am not a ChatGPT prompt master yet. Okay, so form submissions is the last thing I want to talk about. There's really 3 main ways to do that. A thank you page view after the form submission, element visibility, and data layer push. And I would say by far, if you have the ability to do it, the data layer push is the way to do that. And let's look at before we go there. So what I don't like about the thank you page view is that often you don't know what form the person is coming from. If you have multiple forms on a website and they just go to one thank you page, it's sometimes hard to know which form they filled out, which is an important piece of information. 2, if they bookmark it, if something happens, the computer dies on the way over there, you may never get there. So while I've done it and it's a legitimate way to track form submissions, it's not my favorite way. It's not a Fred's practice. The other way is the element, or an other way is an element visibility and the data layer push. So let's look at both of these live. We are in English back. So we're going to go over to our console. We're going to walk Xuxa. Here's your chance to fill out a form to be able to walk my favorite puppy. And I have 2 different forms here. One that looks kind of nice, and then this other one down here that doesn't look as nice, but it's just 2 different forms to do the same thing. So let's fill this one out. All right, so if I go over to Tag Assistant, I'm not seeing anything that talks about walking Xuxa or anything. And the reason for that is because the element visibility, and actually let's move this up a little bit. Let's clear this. The reason for that is that the element visibility was below the fold, was below where I was. So now that it showed up, it fired the tag I'm looking for. And by the way, I specifically like the dummy test tag, which let me just show you that. Often the hard part in GTM is setting up the trigger and getting that right. So I just have a dummy test tag that is an empty custom HTML script, and that's what I use to test it. And then after it's working, then I worry about setting up the related tag. So this is my quick and dirty way to have something fire when a trigger works. So that's what happened over here. That's why it's a dummy test tag, but it didn't fire until the element visibility, until that element was visible, right? It showed up in the viewport. So that's one thing. The other way is through a data layer push. So let's schedule the walk here. And here's the data layer push. Come back here. Here's the data layer push I created. Not much to it. It has to have an event. It's form submitted, walk Shusha, and the form ID if you want it. Now in GTM, I can grab that. I can grab anything from that data layer push. This is a fairly easy process to explain to a developer if you have to, or to do it yourself. And as long as you have an event, you can really call the parameters anything you want. I still go with snake case, but then the values can be whatever you want. And what I'm using in this example is ConvertBox. There are multiple form tools that do this, but if I click on this, my form settings, here are my actions. So it's going to the thank you page. So I could still track it via the thank you page, but it also has scripts. And here's my data layer push to do whatever I want here. This to me is a gold standard for a couple of reasons. One is that you can put anything you want in here. You have full control of that data layer push. Two, it happens at the moment that the form passes all the verifications. So the email is correct, the name is correct, all that stuff is correct, and then it fires. As opposed to waiting till you get to the thank you page, which, as I said, things can happen before you get there. They usually don't, I recognize that, but things can. So I love that data layer push right at the moment that the event the form got submitted. And the obvious thing, and I don't even have to say this, the obvious thing is that you don't want to track it on somebody clicking on here, because you'll get lots of false positives, right? They haven't filled out the form properly. It hasn't gone through verification. You want to wait till the form is successfully submitted. All right. Wow, I think that was a whirlwind. Let's see. So that shows that. So final thoughts. If you really want to change from the ugly glove to the silk glove, for me, I think the best thing you can do is use the dev tools like I just did when you're cruising around the website. Look at what other people are doing. Look at what they're tracking, how they're tracking, what the events look like, what parameters they're using, all that stuff. I've learned so much just from the Data Layer Inspector Plus and David Vallejo's, what's the new name of it? Analytics Debugger. Those two Chrome extensions are just freaking fabulous. So highly recommended to use them. My puppy Shusha, thanks you for sitting around. We have a special offer for everybody if you want to potentially work with Northwoods on a digital retainer or on SEO, on PPC, on GTM. We have a special offer here. And you can always contact me on Twitter, which I'm not on anywhere near as much, or on LinkedIn. All right, Phil.
I just managed to grab that link quickly.
I'm sorry. I can put it back.
Oh, I've put it in the chat. So
awesome.
Hopefully people can see that and a chance to click on it, or if they're on their mobile phones, scan the QR code. So thanks for those tips, Fred, and some great stuff in there. I've also encountered that problem with the client ID being a number, and then kind of like it's like, why did Google think that was a good idea? Like,
right,
it's
exactly.
Just as a reminder for attendees, if you want to get access to Fred's slides, they'll be on the thank you page or the feedback form, which I've also just put into chat. I'm just going to put it in chat again. And there's a breakout room which you can ask Fred further questions. We've actually only got 3 minutes before the next talk for Alex, so they might have to be fast questions, or if they send you a message on LinkedIn and maybe you ask you those questions directly. So thank you again, Fred, for some great material there, and I'm interested and curious to see what's in that privacy course. especially given that the consent mode v2 stuff that's
Oh yeah.
just fairly recently been announced.
Well, of course, consent mode V2 came out after the course was recorded. It's like, oh, geez. I mean, that is always the case, right? So we're going to have to update that.
Okay, yeah, you're always moving the goalposts.
Exactly.
I'm still waiting to hear if conversions are going to be goals as well, or key events, whatever they decide to pick.
I
on the day
hope
of
they
the
don't
week.
become key events. I really hope that, yeah, that faded so quickly. I hope that doesn't happen. That's going to be, well, I mean, it's not the end of the world, but it's a pain in the butt.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions, Fred, but I'll send you a copy of these questions so you can answer them, because Alex and Jen have both asked questions. So I'm just gonna take presenter control now, and
Sounds good. I will stop sharing.
cool.
Thank you. This was
again.
a pleasure. Yeah,